Put this on. For now, you'll have to pass as my wife. Can you manage that?
They'll find you too.
Have you ever wondered what it feels like to die slowly in snow, watching your own blood paint patterns on white ground while the world keeps spinning without you? Subscribe to hear more stories. If this touches your heart, comment "Phi" if you're ready for this journey. Wyoming Territory, February 1882. The land around Bitter Creek stretched endless and merciless, where winter didn't just arrive, but invaded, claiming everything soft and leaving only what could survive its teeth. Aiyana ran through that white hell, her moccasins long since soaked through each step, leaving crimson drops that told her story to anyone who cared to follow. The bullet wound in her side had stopped bleeding an hour ago, not from healing but from cold, her body deciding to save what little warmth remained for her racing heart. Behind her, smoke still rose from what had been her village, not her birth village, that had burned 3 winters past. This was the second home she'd lost to men who saw her people as obstacles to progress. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad needed this valley, and the Apache camps along Ghost River were inconvenient truths on their surveys. She carried something they wanted more than her death, a leather pouch pressed against her ribs, containing correspondence between Railroad Commissioner Hammond and Colonel Morrison, discussing the elimination of indigenous impediments and the massacre disguised as a raid on hostile natives. Evidence that could destroy them both if she lived long enough to deliver it. The storm that had hidden her escape now turned traitor wind, cutting through her torn doskin dress like accusations. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, "When the earth refuses to hold you, find someone whose roots run deeper than hate." That's when she saw it. A thin line of smoke rising from a distant cabin, the only sign of life in this frozen purgatory. Not salvation necessarily. The man inside could be another enemy, another white settler who'd shoot first and never ask questions. But her legs were failing vision tunneling, and the choice was no longer hers to make. Silas McKenna had built his cabin 7 miles from Bitter Creek, precisely because 7 miles meant no unexpected visitors. A man who'd led cavalry charges at Powder River, who'd followed orders that still visited him at 3 in the morning, needed distance from anything that might remind him why he didn't deserve peace. He was checking trap lines when he found her. At first, just a shape in the snow, dark against white like the world's punctuation mark. Could have been a deer taken down by wolves. Should have been for his peace of mind. But the way the wind caught what looked like hair, long and black and tangled with ice, that made him dismount. She was breathing barely, a patchy from the beadwork still clinging to her dress. Young, maybe 20 summers, and dying, definitely dying from cold, and the bullet wound he could see through the torn leather. Her lips moved, shaping words in a language he didn't speak, though he caught one word that transcended translation: please. He'd carried dying men before, brothers in arms who'd begged him to write letters home, to lie to their mothers about how peaceful the end had been. This was different. This was choice, not duty. The moment he lifted her, her eyes opened. Not fully, just enough to show him terror mixing with resignation. Her hand moved weakly toward where a knife should have been muscle memory of defense, even as her body surrendered. Easy, he said, though he doubted she understood. I've got you. The ride back to his cabin took 10 minutes. That felt like hours. She shivered against him once violently, and he pulled her closer without thinking, his coat opening to share what warmth he had. When they reached the cabin, she was unconscious again, but her fingers had somehow found their way to clutch his shirt, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. Inside, he worked with battlefield efficiency. Blankets, first 3 of them. Then the wound. Through and through lucky, if anything about this could be called lucky. He cleaned it with whiskey that made her gasp, even unconscious. Packed it with clean cloth, prayed, without believing that infection hadn't already taken hold. When he finally sat back, hands bloody and shaking slightly from adrenaline, he noticed the pouch she'd protected, even while dying. Official-looking papers pecked out, sealed with wax he recognized. Railroad Commission. He didn't read them. Not yet. But he understood now why she'd been running, why someone had put a bullet in her, why she'd chosen possible death in a storm over certain death behind her. Jesus Christ, he muttered, running a hand over his face. He'd wanted to escape his past, not invite its cousin to dinner. But when she whimpered in her sleep, caught in some nightmare of fire, and lost his hand, moved without permission to smooth her hair back, to whisper, "You're safe. You're safe now." The word safe felt like a lie even as he said it. But sometimes lies were all you had to offer the dying, and sometimes they lived anyway just to spite the truth. Aiyana woke to warmth she didn't trust, and a face she didn't recognize. The last clear memory was running always, running the thunder of cavalry horses, mixing with her uncle's voice, shouting for the children to flee. Now she lay in a bed that smelled of wood smoke and leather, looking up at rough-hewn beams, while a white man sat in a chair nearby cleaning a rifle with methodical patience. Her hand moved instinctively to her side, finding bandages instead of blood. Then to the pouch, still there pressed against her ribs, where she'd sewn it into her dress. The papers Hammond would kill to retrieve that Colonel Morrison had already killed to suppress. The man noticed she was awake, but didn't move sudden. Everything about him was deliberate, careful, like he knew what it meant to be around wounded things. "Water?" he asked, voice low and rough from disuse. She tried to speak but only managed to croak. He poured from a pitcher, helped her sit up enough to drink. His hands were steady, calloused, gentle in a way that confused her. White men's hands in her experience brought violence, or violated. This was neither. "Silas," he said, pointing to himself. Then waited. Aiyana, she managed, though giving her name to a stranger felt like handing over a weapon. He nodded, once accepting the trade. Then he did something unexpected. He moved back to his chair, giving her space. Not hovering, not demanding gratitude or explanation. Just existing in the same room while she oriented herself to still being alive. Her dress had been cleaned and mended, laid carefully over a trunk. Someone, him, had tended her with a respect that made her throat tight. The wound in her side throbbed, but didn't burn with infection's fever. How long had she been unconscious? 3 days, he said, reading her confusion. Storm lasted 2. Trails covered now. 3 days. The relief and terror of that washed over her equal. 3 days meant the immediate pursuit had likely given up. 3 days also meant Hammond had time to spread whatever story he wanted about the unprovoked attack on the peaceful surveying expedition. She tried to stand and immediately regretted it, legs buckling. Silas moved then fast, but not threatening, catching her elbow just enough to steady. "Give it time," he said. "Bullet didn't hit anything vital. But you lost blood. And the cold." He trailed off, but she understood. The cold had nearly finished what the bullet started. Why, she asked the single word, carrying every question. Why save her? Why care? Why risk harboring a fugitive? He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, been on the other side of a rifle too many times, figured it was time to try something different. There were depths to that answer she couldn't navigate, yet currents of old pain that matched her own. She let him help her back to the bed, hating the weakness, but having no choice. That's when they heard it, horses approaching, multiple riders. Silas moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. His jaw tightened. 4 men, 2 in uniform. Aiyana's breath caught. Found. After everything found. But Silas did something that stunned her. He grabbed a blanket, threw it over the blood-stained rags in the corner, pulled a dress from the trunk. Not hers, but something that had belonged to someone else, someone gone. "Put this on," he said urgently. "You're my wife. Been sick with fever. Don't speak much English. Can you do that?" She stared at him, this stranger willing to lie for her. "They'll kill you too. Maybe." He was already moving, adjusting the cabin to look like 2 people lived there regular. "But I doubt it. I know the sergeant leading them." The knock came hard and military. Silas squeezed her shoulder once. Reassurance, warning, promise, all in one gesture. Then went to answer. "Sergeant Patterson," he said, voice different now, easier, like a man with nothing to hide. "Hell of a storm to be riding in." "McKenna." The sergeant's voice was tired, frustrated. "We're looking for an Apache woman. Shot dangerous. Killed 3 men at a surveying camp." Killed 3 men. Silas kept his tone conversational. Must be quite a woman. Railroad Commission wants her bad. She stole something important. Through the cracked bedroom door, Aiyana watched Silas's performance. The easy stance of a man unworried, the casual way he gestured them, inside confident. Because innocent men didn't refuse searches. Coffee, Silas offered. Beth's been sick, but I can manage. Beth Patterson's voice sharpened. My wife came down with fever just before the storm. He raised his voice slightly. Beth, honey, Sergeant Patterson's here. That was her cue. Aiyana emerged, the too large dress hanging, loose hair braided proper like a white woman would wear it. She kept her eyes down, one hand on the doorframe like she was still weak. Patterson studied her, doubt clear on his face. But what he saw was what Silas had crafted. A mixed blood woman, maybe half Mexican or Cherokee, clearly sick, clearly belonging here. Ma'am, Patterson said finally, tipping his hat. She nodded, not trusting her voice, then retreated to the bedroom. Her heart hammered so loud, she was sure they could hear it. The search was perfunctory. Soldiers going through motions, finding nothing because Silas had hidden her dress and moccasins in the root cellar while she was unconscious. If you see anything, Patterson said at the door. I'll ride to town myself, Silas assured him. When they were gone, when the hoofbeats faded to nothing, Aiyana sank onto the bed, shaking. Silas stood by the window watching to make sure they didn't double back. Why? She asked again. This time he answered different. Because they were lying about those 3 men. I knew them. They weren't the type to die easy, especially not to one wounded woman. She looked up at him, then really looked. Saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he'd already started putting pieces together. What did you take? He asked quietly. What's worth killing a whole village for trust was not something her people gave freely anymore, not after so many betrayals. But this man had just risked his life on a lie for her. She pulled out the pouch, handed him the papers. He read in silence, face growing darker with each page. When he finished, he sat heavy in his chair, rubbing his face. Jesus, he breathed. They're planning to clear the whole valley. Every Apache camp between here and Denver. My people found these when they raided a surveyor's camp for food. We only took provisions, but the papers. She swallowed. Hammond couldn't let us live knowing this. Silas looked at her, decision crystallizing in his eyes. Then we make sure everyone knows. We. The word felt foreign, impossible. You need to get these to Fort Russell. There's a telegraph there and a commander who still believes in justice. But you can't travel yet, and they'll be watching the road. Then I wait. He'll go alone when ready. No. The word came firm. You saved evidence that could prevent a massacre. That makes this my fight too. She wanted to protest, to say she didn't need a white man's protection, that she'd survived this long alone. But the truth was harder. She did need help. And somehow, impossibly, this quiet stranger was offering it. Why do you care what happens to Apache? She asked. His answer came slow, heavy with memory. Because I've been the rifle pointing at children who looked just like they could have been my own. Because following orders stopped being enough reason to live with myself. Because maybe helping you is how I start balancing the ledger. Outside, wind picked up again, rattling windows like the world trying to get in. Inside, 2 people who should have been enemies began the careful work of becoming allies. The trust would come slow, built on small things. The way he always knocked before entering the room, how she started making coffee, the way he liked it, without being asked. But it started there, in that moment, with truth laid bare between them. Recovery was its own kind of battle, one fought in inches and minutes, rather than miles and hours. Aiyana had been still for 5 days now, longer than she'd stayed in one place since the raids began. Her body was healing, the wound closing, clean strength returning to her legs. But her mind stayed restless, watching windows, listening for horses that might come back. Silas had developed routines around her presence. Coffee at dawn, checking the property, then coming back to find her attempting something she shouldn't, standing too long trying to haul water, mending things that didn't need mending just to keep her hands busy. You're going to tear those stitches, he said, finding her chopping kindling, despite his specific instructions to rest. Sitting makes me crazy, she replied, accent softening the words in ways that caught him off guard. In my family, even children work. Being useless is shame. Being injured isn't useless. It's healing. She made a sound that might have been Apache for stubborn white man, and kept chopping, though slower. He noticed she held the axe different than he did, more efficient, wasting no motion. "Show me," he said, surprising them both. She looked at him skeptical, then demonstrated. The angle, the twist at impact that made the wood split cleaner. He tried it, adjusted based on her quiet corrections, found it did work better. "My grandfather's way," she said softly. "He said trees give themselves to us, so we should make their sacrifice clean." It was the most she'd shared about her family, and he knew better than to push for more. Instead, he showed her how he'd learned to read weather signs from an old trapper, the way clouds built different when serious snow was coming versus passing flurries. They were teaching each other without meaning to, filling silences with small knowledge that felt safer than big truths. That evening she cooked, wouldn't let him argue about it, used the same provisions he had, but somehow made them taste like food instead of survival. She'd found wild onions under the snow herbs he didn't know were edible, transformed his rabbit stew into something that made his chest tight with memory of home-cooked meals he'd forgotten to miss. "My mother's recipe," she said when he complimented it. She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. Food is memory for Apache. We carry our ancestors in how we season meat. "What else do you carry?" he asked, then immediately regretted the intimacy of the question. But she answered: songs for planting, stories for children, ways to read the flight of birds for weather, how to thank the deer for its life, how to bury our dead so their spirits find the star road. Her voice dropped. "Things that die with us if we're all killed." The weight of that settled between them. Silas thought of his own ancestry, Scottish and German farmers who'd passed down nothing but surnames and a talent for silence. "Teach me something," he said impulsively. "Something that shouldn't be forgotten." She studied him, measuring sincerity. Then she stood, moving to the door despite his protest about the cold. She stepped onto the porch, placed her palm flat on the wooden rail, and spoke words in Apache, liquid sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Morning greeting, she translated. "We thank the directions. East for new beginning, south for warmth and growth, west for evening's rest, north for wisdom of winter, then earth below for holding us, sky above for covering us." Simple, but she struggled for words. "It makes you remember you're not alone, even when alone." "Even here?" he asked. "Especially here." She looked at him sideways. "You think you hide out here because you hate the world, but you built where you can see sunrise and sunset both. You keep that eagle feather on your shelf, though you don't know why. You listen to wind like it might tell you secrets. You're not as disconnected as you believe." The observation hit too close to truth. He looked away out at the darkening sky. "I did things in the war," he said suddenly. "Not the Civil War, the Indian Wars after. Things that seemed necessary then but sit in my gut like poison now." Which things? Her voice held no judgment, just curiosity. "Sand Creek, Washita River. Followed orders to burn winter supplies, knowing it meant families would starve." He couldn't look at her. There was this girl, couldn't have been more than 10, found her hiding in a burned lodge. "I was supposed to, but I couldn't. Let her run. My sergeant saw nearly court-martialed me for dereliction." "But you let her run," Aiyana said softly. "One child. After how many didn't get to run?" She was quiet a long moment. "Then my cousin was at Sand Creek. She survived because a soldier threw a blanket over her, told her to play dead. One soldier among hundreds who didn't hesitate. But that one mattered. To her, to her children who exist because of that blanket. Doesn't balance the scales." "No," she agreed. "But scales are white man's thinking. Apache thinks circles. Everything returns. Everything continues. You did evil, you do good. Both exist in you. The question is which one you feed tomorrow." That night, she showed him how her people navigated by stars. Not just the obvious ones, but the subtle patterns that revealed direction and season. He shared his grandfather's trick for predicting weather by the behavior of cattle, knowledge he hadn't thought of in years. They were building something neither had name for. Not friendship, exactly, too careful for that. Not romance, though awareness lived in how they moved around each other. Something older, maybe. The recognition between two people who'd seen too much to pretend the world was simple. When she finally tired, he helped her back inside her hand, on his arm for balance. She didn't need as much support as she accepted, he realized. She was allowing him to help, giving him purpose. "Tomorrow I teach you to track properly," she said. "You walk like cavalry still, straight lines, heavy heel. Land remembers everything. Should walk like you're asking permission. And you'll let me show you how to handle a rifle better," he countered. "You shoot like someone taught you, quick and dirty. Fine for hunting. But if trouble comes..." "When trouble comes," she corrected. "When trouble comes, you'll need to be better than fine." They looked at each other across the small space, understanding passing between them. They were preparing for war without saying it, teaching each other survival skills that had nothing to do with weather or cooking. The papers still sat hidden beneath a floorboard wrapped in oilcloth, waiting. But first, Aiyana needed strength, and Silas needed to remember what it felt like to fight for something besides orders or pay. Outside, an owl called long and low. "Death omen," she said quietly. "Or just an owl hunting," he replied. "Both," she said. "Apache believe many truths exist together." He thought about that as she settled for sleep, about multiple truths existing in the same space. The truth that she was Apache and he was white. The truth that their peoples were enemies. The truth that they were sharing food and fire and knowledge anyway. The truth that he was starting to dread the day she'd be strong enough to leave. 2 weeks had passed since Silas found her bleeding in the snow, and the cabin had transformed in ways neither of them discussed, but both felt. Her things, the mended dress, the moccasins she was making from rabbit hide, the herbs drying by the window, had found permanent places. His spaces had adjusted around hers without complaint, coffee pot moving to make room for her tea herbs, his spare shirt becoming hers without question. She could walk the full property now, though she still tired quicker than she'd admit. He'd watch her sometimes from the window as she gathered plants, poking through snow, moving with the fluid grace. Her people were known for pausing occasionally to touch the earth in that greeting ritual she'd taught him. This morning was different. She stood at the table, the hidden papers spread before her, jaw tight with something between rage and grief. "I need to tell you," she said when he entered, "about that night. You should know what you're risking." He poured coffee, sat across from her, waited. "My band was camped at Singing Water, what your maps call Ghost Creek. 32 people, mostly families who'd already been pushed from 2 other places. We thought winter would protect us, that no one would move against us in the snow." Her fingers traced the edge of one paper, Hammond's signature, bold and damning. "The surveying team came first, friendly, said they were just mapping, meant no harm. Our leader, Joseph Crowfeather, even shared food with them. But I saw them counting, our warriors, our weapons, our children. I told Joseph, but he said I was seeing shadows from old hurt. You weren't wrong. 3 nights later they came with soldiers. But not regular army, hired guns wearing uniforms led by a man named Carson. They hit the family's lodges first." Her voice stayed steady, but her knuckles went white. "The screaming, children pulled from their mothers. I saw my sister's baby." She stopped, breath shaky. Silas reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough she could feel the warmth. "My sister pushed her baby into my arms, told me to run. I said I wouldn't leave her," she said. Aiyana's voice cracked. "Someone has to remember us." Then she grabbed a rifle and ran the opposite direction, drawing them away. "She saved you. She died for me." Her and 12 others fighting while the rest scattered. "I was running when I heard Carson shouting about papers, about finding the documents. That's when I realized the surveyor I'd seen reading these had left them behind. I circled back, found them in the abandoned camp. That was brave. That was stupid. But I thought if they wanted them so badly, they must matter. I barely got away. Carson's bullet found me at the creek." She looked up at him. "Now you know, I'm not some innocent victim. I chose to take these. I chose to make myself a target. You chose to fight back. And now you choose too. Every day you let me stay, you choose." He was quiet, refilling both their cups, thinking. Then he stood, went to a locked trunk she'd never seen him open. Inside were his own ghosts. Military commendations, a discharge paper, and underneath a journal. He handed it to her. "Since we're sharing truths." She opened it carefully, his handwriting younger and steadier, describing operations she recognized. Washita River, Summit Spring. And then later entries, the writing, changing, becoming questions. How do we call them savage when we burn their food stores before winter? How is this different from what Sherman did to Georgia? When did I stop seeing children and start seeing threats? The last entry was dated 3 years ago. Cannot continue. Will not continue. God forgive me, but I choose desertion over one more dead child. You were cavalry, she said, not quite a question. Captain, led charges against camps just like yours. Followed orders that. He took the journal back, closed it. I told myself it was duty. That they were hostiles. That we were bringing civilization. Lies men tell themselves so they can sleep. But you stopped. Too late. After too much. They sat with their truths between them, the weight of history and blood. But also something else, the understanding that came from admitting the worst and not being rejected for it. We're quite a pair, Aiyana said finally. The cavalry deserter and the Apache fugitive could be worse. How could be doing this alone? That hung between them, more intimate than any touch. The acknowledgement that whatever this was, alliance, friendship, something unnamed, it mattered. That afternoon she insisted on teaching him to move silent through snow, laughing when he stumbled, when his boot cracked a hidden branch. You think like a soldier still. Straight lines, destination focused. The land is not your enemy to conquer. She demonstrated her recovered strength, evident in how she seemed to float over the same ground that crunched under his weight. How he asked, frustrated but amused, feel first with your weight, then commit. Like dancing. I don't dance. All movement is dancing. Fighting, hunting, walking. Your body and the earth finding rhythm. She took his hand, the first time she'd initiated touch, and guided him through the motion. His awareness narrowed to that point of contact, her fingers calloused but careful. Better, she said, releasing him. Now try alone. He did, still clumsy but improving. When he looked back, she was watching with an expression he couldn't rid. That evening, as she made dinner from the venison he'd hunted, and the roots she'd gathered, domesticity settled around them, dangerous and warm. He repaired her moccasins where the stitching had worn fingers, careful with the beadwork she'd salvaged. You don't have to, she said. Want to. She watched him work, this white man, treating her things with reverence her own people would show. When this is over. Don't, he said quietly. Not yet. Because they both knew when this was over meant decisions. The papers delivered, Hammond exposed or not, justice served or denied. And then, what she couldn't stay hidden in his cabin forever. He couldn't pretend the world wouldn't come looking eventually. But for now, in the space between their separate catastrophes and whatever came next, they had this. Teaching and learning. Coffee and herbs. Stories traded for skills. Her hand steadying his aim with her bow. His voice reading to her from books she'd never had access to. Trust built from necessity becoming something that felt dangerously like choosing. That night, a sound woke them both. Horses distant but approaching. They moved, without speaking, practice now. She gathered the papers while he checked weapons. But this time she didn't hide. She stood beside him at the window, watching the darkness. 3 riders, she whispered, eyes better in the dark than his. Armed, yes. They waited, breath synchronized, watching the riders pause at the property line. One dismounted, studied the ground where their tracks crossed. Then they mounted again and rode on, either satisfied or planning to return with daylight. We're running out of time, she said. I know. Fort Russell is 4 days' ride. In good weather. Weather won't be good for another month. They won't wait a month. He turned to her in the darkness, could barely make out her features, but felt her resolution. Together, he said, we go together or not at all. They're not hunting you. They will be once we move. Man traveling with Apache woman, that's choosing sides clear enough. Then why? Because someone has to remember us, he said, echoing her sister's words. Someone has to witness what they're doing and say it was wrong. Because maybe that's how I balance my ledger, not by hiding, but by standing with you against them. She was quiet so long he thought she'd refuse. Then her hand found his in the darkness, fingers interlacing. The circle, she whispered. You see it now. Everything returns. They stood at the window until the horizon lightened, hands linked, watching for danger but finding only morning. Soon they'd have to move to risk everything on a chance for justice. But for now, they had this moment, choosing each other against history, against logic, against the world that said they should be enemies. The owl called again, closer this time. "Still think it's just hunting?" she asked. "No," he admitted. "Death's coming. Then we face it. Together. Together." The word settled between them like a vow witnessed by nothing but dawn and the decision to stop running. The change came quietly, like frost creeping over a window pane, seen only when it was too late. That morning the world was still the air, brittle and white. The only sound came from the creak of pine branches bending under snow. Inside the cabin, Silas poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, the steam ghosting between them. Aiyana sat by the fire, brushing her hair with slow, rhythmic strokes. Then the horse appeared. The mail rider almost never stopped at McKenna's place. His route ran straight past the ridge. But this time, the man turned up the frozen trail horse, panting clouds into the air. McKenna the rider called, his voice tight. "Got something for you." Silas stepped outside, rifle visible across his back. The man's hands trembled as he dug through his saddlebag and pulled out an envelope marked with the seal of the Territorial Railroad Commission. "They paid me extra to hand-deliver it," the rider muttered. "Said it's personal." Silas nodded once. "Appreciate it, Jim." The rider glanced toward the cabin window where Aiyana's shadow moved behind the curtain. "Everything all right out here?" "Fine as ever," Silas said. The man hesitated as if he wanted to say more, then turned his horse and rode back toward Bitter Creek, vanishing into the white. Silas opened the letter by the fence post. The words were printed in a bureaucrat's neat script. "Commissioner Hammond requests the pleasure of your company for discussions regarding land rights and recent unfortunate misunderstandings. Your cooperation in resolving certain missing documents would be appreciated and rewarded. Should you choose not to attend, alternative measures may be necessary to ensure regional stability." Silas read it twice, then handed it to Aiyana when she joined him on the porch. "He knows," she whispered. "He suspects," Silas replied. "This is bait. He's testing how desperate I am. Will you go?" He studied the horizon. The land between him and Bitter Creek stretched out under snow and silence. "We've been playing defense too long," he said. "Maybe it's time we draw first blood." 2 days later, he saddled his horse at dawn. Aiyana tried once more to stop him. "If you ride to town, you walk into his fire." "Maybe," Silas said, tightening the girth. "But if I don't, he'll bring the fire here." He rode out through the frozen mesquite, his figure swallowed by the pale light. Aiyana stood at the window until the last sound of hooves faded. Then she turned, checked the rifle he'd taught her to use, and began stacking ammunition by the door. Bitter Creek looked busier than usual. Wagons filled with lumber and crates lined the street. Men in coats too fine for labor lounged near the saloon. Railroad guards, pretending to be travelers. Marshal Briggs stood on the boardwalk outside his office, chewing a toothpick. "Silas," he called. "Heard you might be coming in. Word travels. Hammond's holed up at the hotel. Brought 6 men, all meaner than they look. Appreciate the warning." Briggs caught his arm before he could pass. "Listen, Hammond's the sort that smiles while someone else does his killing. Don't give him reason." Silas only nodded. The hotel smelled of smoke, perfume, and power. Inside the restaurant, every table had been cleared but one. Hammond sat there with 3 men behind him, guns visible under their coats, eyes sharp. Mr. McKenna, Hammond said, smiling thinly. "Please sit." "I'll stand." Hammond sighed like a man inconvenienced by principle. "I believe you've come into possession of something that belongs to me. Can't think what that be." "Documents," Hammond said. "Taken from a surveying camp by hostiles who murdered 3 of my men. I heard it was Apache defending their water from trespassers." "Perspective," Hammond murmured, "is the luxury of the powerless. Facts, however, remain." He leaned forward. "Those papers contain private correspondence and mineral assessments. Their return would be compensated." "How compensated?" $1,000. Cash. "No questions about the company you keep." Silas's expression didn't change. "And if these papers don't exist?" Hammond's smile hardened. Then certain reports might reach Fort Russell about a deserter harboring fugitives. Amazing how war crimes never fade with time. There it was, the velvet-gloved threat. Silas nodded once. "I'll think about it." "Think fast," Hammond said. "My patience extends exactly 3 days." On the ride back, the cold bit deeper. Somewhere behind him a shadow followed. Not close enough to confront, just near enough to remind. He took the long trail home, crossing the frozen creek twice, doubling back until even the coyotes lost his scent. But when he reached his land, he still felt the eyes. Aiyana met him at the door. Relief flashed through her face before she hid it. "They know about me," Silas said. "About you too. About everything. Then we run tonight." "No, that's what they expect. Every road out will be watched." Then what he unfolded, a telegram from his coat. "I sent word to Commander Wallace at Fort Russell. If the man still believes in justice, help's coming. And if he doesn't, Silas checked the rifle's chamber. Then we fight our way out." That night they prepared. Weapons, clean provisions, packed horses hidden in the barn. Aiyana burned sage and sang softly in Apache, her voice low and steady. "You pray to your God," she told him. "I'll pray to mine. Maybe one listens." Silas didn't answer. He believed in her more than heaven. The next day brought strangers. 2 riders appeared out of the pines, Apache young but hard-eyed. Aiyana froze, then ran to them. Words poured from her in rapid Apache. She embraced them fiercely. "My cousins," she said when she turned back. "They found me." The men looked at Silas. One spoke English, careful but cold. "You the white man keeping her, I'm the man helping her." They exchanged glances, murmuring to Aiyana in their language. She argued back, gestures sharp. Finally, the English speaker said, "She says you're trustworthy, that you fought for her." "For her," Silas said simply. The man's face softened a little. "I am Marcus. This is Samuel. We came to take her home." "There's no home left," Aiyana said. "They burned it." "We are rebuilding," Marcus insisted. The survivors gathered deeper in the mountains. She looked torn. Silas saw it, the pull of blood against the bond they'd built. "Go," he said quietly, though the word cut. "Be with your people. I'll get the papers to the fort." "No," she said. "We started this together." Marcus argued in Apache voice, rising. She answered just as fiercely. Silas heard his own name repeated again and again. At last Marcus turned to him. "She says her path stays with you. But we will stay too. 4 fighters are better than 2. This isn't your fight." Samuel spoke for the first time, rough English but true. "White man helps Apache woman, then all fight." Evening fell with an eerie calm. The air felt too still, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm or blood. "They'll move by new moon," Marcus said. "Dark night for dark work." "Then we move first," Silas decided. Into their trap, through it. They set their plan. Marcus and Samuel would ride north, leaving false tracks. Aiyana and Silas would go south toward Fort Russell. But before they left, Aiyana caught Silas's arm. "If something happens, nothing will. Listen, if I die, burn the papers. Don't let them win." "You're not dying," he said. "Not on my watch." She studied him for a heartbeat, then kissed him. Not soft, not desperate, real. "For luck," she said. "Apache custom, number mine." Then came the sound of hooves. 5 riders moved through the trees, torches low. Carson led them, Hammond's hired gun face, scarred grin jagged. McKenna, he called. "Send out the squaw and the papers. This don't concern you." Silas answered with a rifle shot that took the brim off Carson's hat. "That's your warning," he shouted. Carson laughed. 5 against 1. "You ain't that good. He's not alone," Marcus yelled from the barn. "Or fighting for money," Aiyana added. That silenced them for a second. Mercenaries weren't used to conviction staring back at them from rifle sights. "Hammond doubles pay for whoever brings him the papers," Carson bellowed. Greed overrode fear. They spurred forward. The first volley lit the night. Silas and Aiyana fired from the cabin windows, rhythm perfect, reload cover fire. Marcus dropped one from the rafters. Samuel struck from the tree line, a ghost with a rifle. In minutes it was over. 3 men lay in the snow. 2 fled. Carson crawled, blood trailing behind him. Silas followed boot-crunching ice. He kicked the pistol from Carson's reach. "This ain't over," Carson spat. "Hammond owns the judges, the marshals, hell, the whole damn territory." "Then we'll take it above the territory," Silas said, stepping back. He let Carson live. Fear spreads faster than corpses. "Now we ride," Marcus urged. "He'll bring more." Aiyana paused at the doorway, laying a hand against the cabin's rough wall. She whispered something in Apache. "What did you say?" Silas asked. "Thanking it," she said, "for sheltering us, asking it to stand empty rather than hold evil." Behind them, Samuel tossed a torch into the barn. Flames roared upward, masking their retreat in smoke. Aiyana watched the fire reflected in Silas's eyes. "You're home," she said softly. He looked at her. "Home's not where you hide. It's who you stand with." She reached across the space between their horses, lacing her fingers with his. "Then we're both home." They rode as dawn broke, a thin gold line crawling over the mountains. By the time Bitter Creek woke, the smoke had settled. Hammond stood on the ridge above the burned cabin, gloved hands clasped behind his back. "They'll head for Fort Russell," he said to the men beside him. "Send word to every post between here and there. I want them found." Below the ashes whispered in the wind. Far down the trail, two riders and their shadows moved against the rising sun, one man scarred by war, one woman carved by survival. Between them, the space was filled not with fear, but something heavier, stronger choice. And in that choice, the West itself seemed to hold its breath. Because out here, justice and love both cost blood, and neither came cheap. Fort Russell rose from the Wyoming plains, like civilization's last argument against wilderness, bastions of adobe yellow stone and black cannon-mouths flags snapping in a knife-cold wind. Silas had hoped to reach it, undetected, a quiet slip from threat into jurisdiction. But as they crested the last low ridge, the world unfolded its bad surprise. A line of riders waited on the snow-dulled plain, not soldiers, but hired guns in town coats and trail-dirty boots. 15, maybe more, their horses stamping frost into powder. And there at the center, like a banker pretending to be a general, sat Hammond, gloved and neat, the smile on his face the kind men practice in mirrors. "Trap Marcus," muttered. "No," Silas said, studying the semicircle and the crowd gathering on the fort's wall. "Theater. He wants this public." Aiyana took it in the way the hired guns fanned out to cut angles, the way townsfolk clustered along the palisade, and the gate the way soldiers leaned on their Springfield rifles, with an air of boredom they did not feel. "Kill us here," she said in front of witnesses, "and he controls the story." They rode down, slow, weapons visible but not drawn. The cold pressed against their teeth. The hired guns opened to a half-ring that closed behind them by subtle inches. Aiyana could smell lye soap and tobacco and the sour metal edge of fear. Hammond nudged forward. His voice carried clean to the fort. "Silas McKenna, you harbor fugitives and stolen property. Surrender both, and you ride away free." Silas let the silence balance for a breath. "Funny thing about stolen property," he called back. "Sometimes it tells interesting stories." He drew the oilskin packet and held the papers high, angling them so sun flashed across the embossed seal. "Like how the railroad commissioned murder. Like how certain people ordered soldiers to clear Apache camps by any means necessary." Hammond's eyes flicked just once, calculating what the wall could see. "Forged documents," he snapped. "Apache lies. With your signature, your seal, murmur on the rampart." A rustle in the watching crowd below, wheelwrights and laundresses and wives and boys who came for spectacle and found a reckoning. Hammond felt it, the shift of air before wind becomes storm. "Captain McKenna is a deserter," Hammond shouted. "Court-martialed for cowardice. Why would anyone believe? Because I'm here." The voice came from the open gates. Commander Wallace walked out with a file of uniformed men. He was older than Silas remembered, but the old carriage remained the stiff straightness that comes from years of holding lines no one else will hold. Snow clung to his mustache like ash. Commander Hammond said quickly, relief hidden in outrage, "This is railroad business. Murder is army business." Wallace cut across, not raising his voice, "Especially when our uniforms get used for massacre." He turned to Silas, and in that turn were unsent letters and winter marches and something like weary affection. "Captain, you've been gone a long time." "Sir, is what you carry worth the price of bringing it here?" Silas dismounted. He walked forward past Hammond's line as if they were brush to be parted, not guns to be feared. Horses tossed their heads. Fingers tightened along triggers. Aiyana's heartbeat found the old drum hidden in her ribs. Marcus shifted slightly. Samuel melted into the lee of a snow hummock and became absence. Silas reached Wallace and handed him the papers. Hammond's tone sharpened. "Arrest them, now," but threat aimed at one man and an Apache woman was not the same as threat thrown toward federal infantry, laid out in blue wool beneath the flag. The hired guns hesitated. Carson Sling, still binding his shoulder from another night's math, forced his horse up beside Hammond. "This goes bad," he muttered. "We're outnumbered. I pay you to a crack, split the cold." Samuel's bullet shaved the felt off Carson's replacement hat and took it into the air like a magic trick. Marcus appeared on the far flank with a second rifle already shouldered. "Apache ghosts," one of the men breathed, and the whisper moved like a contagion. Wallace read without hurry, turning each page as if it were the gear of a clock. As he went, his jaw set. When he finished, he folded the papers with care as if the crease itself were testimony. "Mr. Hammond," he said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, theft of federal lands, and impersonating military authority." "You can't," Hammond barked, casting for his footing. "I have rights. I have lawyers." "You have the right," Wallace said evenly, "to explain to a federal judge why you ordered the killing of civilians." Hammond's hand went for his pistol, a stupid, desperate move by a man too long protected by other men's violence. 3 shots answered as one. Silas's slug took Hammond high in the shoulder. Aiyana's cut the belt and drove him sideways. Wallace's found the arm that reached for the gun and spoiled its use. Hammond tumbled out of the saddle into the dirty snow, the pristine front of his coat turning a busy shade of red. Aiyana walked to him. Hammond tried to prop himself with his good elbow and spat blood and hatred. "Savage." "Yes," she said quietly. "Savage enough to survive you." The semicircle broke. Men who fight for gold and not for conviction have a very keen sense of the wind. Carson tried to rally them and found himself staring at 4 rifles on a line. 2 Army, 1 Frontier, 1 Apache. He measured, then looked at Aiyana, and whatever hatred he carried could not erase the grudging respect that edged his glance toward Silas. "This ain't over," he said. "It is for you," Silas told him. "Next time I see you, only one of us walks away." Carson believed him. He signaled. The hired guns peeled out of the half-ring and rode for distance and deniability. Wallace motioned 2 corporals. "Carry him to the infirmary," he said of Hammond. "There'll be no dying before a deposition." Then to Silas, with the old command reined in. "We need to talk. Privately." Wallace's office was layered with the smell of paper and oil and floorboard, dust, the quiet bureaucracy of empire, trying to hold a continent in place. He poured 3 whiskeys, 1 for himself, 1 for Silas, 1 set in front of Aiyana, without comment. She did not thank him, and he did not require it. "You disappeared 3 years ago," Wallace said, taking only a whet of his own glass. "Left me with a mess of explanations. I left you with the truth," Silas said. "The truth that you refused orders to fire on a peaceful village." Wallace's eyes traveled to the map on the wall, black pins in red country. "I knew those orders were wrong. I knew it then. But the system, Washington investors, men like Hammond, you followed them anyway." Wallace didn't look away. "I did." He lifted the papers. "And I've been looking for a way to make that right since." He tapped the packet. "This goes to Washington. A clear line from corporate ambition to blood with our uniforms as the instrument. There will be hearings. Men who never smell dust will talk about dust for months. It won't bring anyone back, but it will cost them." "For Hammond," Aiyana said. "What about my people?" Wallace faced her fully. "The survivors can return to Ghost Creek. I'll post guards to ensure no misunderstandings. No surveying within 20 miles. I will sign it as a military reservation pending civil adjudication." "Until the next Hammond comes," Aiyana said, bitterness clean as a blade. "I can't promise forever," Wallace answered. But I can promise this, your testimony, and these documents will pull a curtain back. Once folks see the machine, some refuse to let it run. And Silas Aiyana asked. His desertion, Wallace opened a drawer and set a small file on the desk. He slid out a single paper official as Winter. Captain Silas McKenna was honorably discharged for medical reasons, battle fatigue 3 years ago. Says so right here in the record I am about to file. Silas stared at the neat lines of ink. The mercy of bureaucracy turned in a kinder direction. Sir, I owed you that much, Wallace said, for being the only one with courage to say no when the rest of us talked about courage and spent other people's lives. The wind touched the shutters. It sounded to Aiyana like the long breath of the plain after a storm. The fort at evening is a town with walls. Mess kettles clanged, mules brayed. A bugle ran a silver thread through the air and disappeared as if pulled into cloth. Aiyana stood on the parapet looking east, where the land dropped away to a blue distance. Below her, cousins moved through the yard like smoke, Marcus talking with a sergeant about routes, Samuel cleaning a rifle with the reverence of a prayer. She could go with them, help gather the survivors from the canyons and the brush cuts, and the winter-dark gullies where grief hides. She could be only Apache again, the old words and the old songs and the old authority of grandmothers who tend fire and history both. Silas came beside her and did not touch her or speak. He let the view say its words first. I don't know where I belong anymore, Aiyana said at last. With them, I am the woman who lived with a white man. With your people, I am always Apache. Where is home for someone between worlds? Maybe home isn't about fitting. And Silas answered, maybe it's about who accepts you as you are. The cabin's burned, she reminded him. We'll build another. People will talk, she said. Apache woman. White man, let them. It won't be safe. There'll be other Hammonds. Then we'll fight them too. She turned to him. Why choose this difficulty? Silas searched for something clean and found it. When I found you in the snow, I thought I was saving you. But you saved me from the emptiness, from the silence, from the kind of man war leaves behind, to rot standing up. I didn't save you, she said gently. You saved yourself by choosing to help. Then we saved each other. They watched the light do its slow work. Gold bled to pink, and the red that followed was the sacred color, the one her grandmother said the land wears when it remembers who paid for it. Aiyana felt the prickle of tears that were not sorrow, but recognition. Your God and mine, she murmured. Maybe they are not so different. Maybe they both want us to choose love over fear. Is that what we're choosing? She took his hand, lacing brown and white, past and future. Yes. Footsteps approached. Marcus spoke in Apache, and she answered the syllables like river stones smoothed from centuries of use. She gestured to Silas. Marcus measured him, then said in English for Silas's sake, she says her medicine leads her to build bridges. Our grandmother was a bridge builder. Between clans, between hunger and harvest, between grief and the next morning. Hard work, Silas said. Most important things, our Marcus answered and extended his hand. Silas took it, and the clasp felt old and new at once. Samuel lifted 2 fingers from the yard below, the smallest salute. Aiyana returned it. Night in Wallace's fort was a different country. The gate was barred with a long iron pin that had been lifted by the same tired corporal for 10 years. The guard lamps painted the yard in honey and coal. Somewhere a piano warbled from the non-commissioned club, a hymn pretending to be a waltz or the other way around. Wallace had them quartered in an empty captain's room, 2 bunks a table, a window with a rectangle of moon. The papers lay between them like a quiet fire. These go to Washington now, Aiyana said. They do, Silas agreed, but paper is only one kind of weapon. Then our part is done. Our part is just beginning, he said. This is a battle. The war is the story people tell themselves about what is right. We keep telling the truer one until it sticks. She leaned into him. For the first time since the desert and the shack and the running, the closeness was not bandage, but choice. Teach me something, she said, echoing a lesson by a dying fire weeks ago. What how your people say forever. Silas considered, and all the church words he'd heard as a boy fell away like chaff. We say, "I do" at weddings, but that's really, "I will." Maybe forever is choosing the same person every morning, winter and drought and war and chores. Choosing again. "Then I choose you," she said simply. "Today, tomorrow, through whatever comes, I choose you too." Outside, a sentry coughed. A mule snorted. The piano found its way to the end of a tune. Aiyana closed her eyes and saw dawn instead of night, saw them riding out, not into an ending, but into work. Morning brought a sky the color of tin with light under it like coals in fog. Wallace met them at the gate, hat under arm. He looked like a man who had not slept much, but had arrived somewhere anyway. "Warrants went east at dawn," he said. "A telegraph to Cheyenne, another to the territorial governor. I don't know what the law will do. I know what we will." He handed Silas a folded envelope sealed in blue wax. "This is your discharge," he said. "Carry it when you can't carry anything else." "And them?" Aiyana asked, meaning her cousins, and the thin line of people already forming in the yard. Women, with bundles, 2 old men, with a drum, 3 children in coats too big. "I'll send a squad with them to Ghost Creek," Wallace said. "Not to patrol you, Miss Aiyana. To patrol the people who would decide they own you." Aiyana nodded. "Then I will give you names," she said, "of those who did not live to tell their own, so that when you testify you carry them with you. The land remembers. The paper should too." Wallace swallowed once before he answered. "Write them," he said. "I'll read them in the hearing room if they allow it. And if they don't, I'll read them in the hallway where the reporters wait." They found a quiet bench by the sally port. Aiyana wrote in a neat hand that had learned English letters without betraying Apache rhythm. Kuruk's wife, Ayen, the sisters who used to sing at the spring, a boy who always carried 2 stones in his pocket to remind himself of balance. She added their kin names and the meaning of them. "Bear who watches river between dawn after ash." Wallace took the paper as if it were a living thing. "Thank you," he said. "Do something with it," she replied. He nodded and folded their dead into his breast pocket. They left at first light, second thought, when the world is not yet fully committed today. The fort's gates swung open with a groan that sounded to Silas like the end of a chapter. He and Aiyana rode side by side. Marcus and Samuel ranged ahead, their silhouettes proof that some ghosts choose to keep their bodies. Beyond the ditch and the glacis, the land was just land again, not jurisdiction. Frost snapped under hooves. Cottonwoods along the creek wore a rime that made them look like old men who smoked too much and had no plans to stop. They kept an easy pace until the fort was a low wall in a long memory. Only then did Aiyana speak. "What will you tell people when they ask what we are?" True, Silas said. "True is not a kind," she answered. "It is when they want to put you in a box. There is no box for true." She smiled at that in a way that made him feel 15 and 50 both. "There is a word my grandmother used," she said, "for a bridge between winters, for the food hidden under the snow, and the pity that is not weakness. Kea hostly home arises." "Home arises," he repeated, trying to sound like a new saddle. "Then that's what we do." They turned slightly off the road, then down a line that was more idea than path toward where their burned place waited in ash to be something else. Bitter Creek greeted them with the skepticism of a town that has learned not to love too quickly. The saloon piano tried a brave rag. The blacksmith's hammer ticked like a metronome for honest work. Marshal Briggs stood like a knot in pine. "You made a day of it," he said, eyes cutting to the open air behind them where Hammond's men were notable by their absence. Heard wild stories on the noon rider. Heard tamer ones from a trooper with a nervous mustache. "Most stories are true from their angle," Silas said. Briggs nodded at Aiyana with a courtesy that was not performative. "Ma'am." "Marshal," she said, and inclined her head acknowledging office, and also the man who had once looked the other way so a hunting party could pass without hassle. "Folks'll talk," Briggs warned low, "some with mouths, some with guns. But today, at least, we get to stack the odds. I'll walk the street twice each evening for a while. And there's a preacher woman," he meant Mrs. Calhoun, "who preached without a pulpit and collected stray children like a trapper collects pelts, who asked me to give you this." He handed Aiyana a small parcel wrapped in flour paper. Inside were 3 iron nails, a twist of sage, and a folded note for a threshold and a blessing. There was also a single peppermint stick. Aiyana laughed softly and then unexpectedly cried. Briggs looked away to give her the privacy of a public place. "You two need anything from the office, you come quiet or loud." "Thank you," Silas said. Briggs spat into the snow. "I didn't do anything," he said, which is sometimes the bravest thing a lawman can do when evil wants a stage. They reached the homestead close to sundown. What had been barn was now gray ribs leaning toward the ground smoke, long gone, but the smell of it still working low in the timber. The cabin Aiyana's palm had rested there, and asked it to stand empty, rather than shelter evil held its promise. The doorway was a black mouth into nothing. The hearthstone sat indifferent and ready. Aiyana dismounted and ran her fingers along the char. Ash came away and made a small crescent on her skin. She touched the mark to her forehead and then to the lintel. "Thank you," she said to the air in Apache, and to the wood that had carried them. Silas set to with the kind of hunger that is not for food. He measured the front sill with the end of an old rein and marked a line in the dirt with his boot heel. Marcus and Samuel cut poles from the cottonwood stand with the quiet efficiency of men who know what a night without walls can do to a mine. They worked until dark, and then threw it by the light of a lantern and a moon that had been growing since the fort. They set no roof that first night. The walls came up to a man's shoulder, and that was enough to change the way the wind felt. Aiyana hung the twist of sage from Mrs. Calhoun in the half-frame doorway with the peppermint tied beside it, because blessings come in more shapes than one. She drove the 3 nails into the new threshold herself, the blows sure and clean. When they finally stopped, sweat steamed from their backs into the night. They sat on the ground inside the new rectangle of home and ate beans warmed in a black pan and corn cakes with a little honey Silas had hidden and forgotten. Marcus told a story of a coyote who tried to marry the moon. Samuel laughed, once the sound like something breaking free. Silas looked at Aiyana over the half-built wall. She had ash on her cheek and the look in her eyes of a woman who has outrun darkness not by speed but by stubbornness. He reached out and set his hand on the new sill. She set hers next to it, and there between their fingers the old world and the new made a treaty. In the small hours, coyotes sang beyond the creek. Aiyana woke and went outside. The stars were so many and so sharp they made her think of her grandmother's stories, that each star is a campfire in the sky where the ones you love wait for you to tell your best tale. She whispered names, the ones she had given Wallace for Washington, and then the ones that were only for her. She ended with one she had not said in years, the name she had been called as a child, when she outran the other girls on the ridge, she who goes between. Silas came to the door and leaned in the frame that wasn't built yet. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I am listening," she said. "To what?" "To everything that wants to keep us," she said and smiled. "It is loud tonight." He stepped out and stood beside her. Their shoulders touched. The half-house at their back made a small shadow on the ground. "We'll finish the roof tomorrow," he said. "Walls after. Then we go get your people and bring them food and wood and words they can use." And when the next Hammond comes, she asked not in fear, but in planning. Silas looked up at the scattered fires and then at the line of their roof not yet there. "Then we do this again," he said. "We stand where he wants to stand, and we name the cost out loud where everyone can hear." Aiyana nodded, satisfied. "Then we sleep," she said, and took his hand, and together they walked back across the threshold that was 3 nails and a blessing and a promise. At dawn, Mrs. Calhoun arrived with a wagon piled in a manner that suggests a woman who has out-argued men for a living. Lumber shingles a packet of letters from the Seamstress Guild in Cheyenne, promising quilts by spring. Behind the wagon came 2 soldiers, leading a mule loaded with flour and salt pork. Briggs trudged up an hour later, with a coil of wire and a posthole digger. By noon, 4 ranch wives had set a pot the size of a bathtub on the new hearth, and were arguing fiercely about the correct thickness of stew. No one said the word desertion. No one said savage where Aiyana could hear it, What they said instead were the names of tools and the names of children and the names of recipes. Work is an excellent language when people share too little else. Marcus and Samuel left at mid-afternoon with 3 troopers to scout Ghost Creek. Aiyana pressed her palm to Marcus's chest in goodbye, and he to hers. They did not say, "Take care." They said, "Take courage." It amounts to the same in the end. When the sun fell, the cabin had a roof. It was ugly and perfect. The wind tested it, and it held. In the quiet, after Aiyana fetched the packet from Wallace's office, the document with a list of names, she read them again at the new hearth, and then tucked the pages into a tin box beneath a stone with a hawk feather on top. "The land remembers," she said. "So will we." Silas brought a small thing wrapped in deer hide and laid it on the table. "Found this in the ash," he said. "It didn't burn." She unwrapped a little carving of a kachina a traveler had once traded for beans and water. It had always sat on the hearth at the old place. The paint was blistered now, but the eyes still looked brave. She set it on the sill. "We did not burn either," she said. He smiled, and the lines at the corners of his mouth looked like the map of a good country. They ate in the doorway where summer will one day live, and winter was merely visiting, and they did not talk about forever. They did the harder thing. They planned tomorrow. Posts for a fence, a ride to the spring to bless it, a meeting in town where Briggs would stand bored and dangerous, and Wallace would write a letter that made a senator cough. When they lay down on their bedrolls, the roof above them sounded like a drum touched lightly by snow. Aiyana closed her eyes and saw not the fort and its witness, or the plain and its theater, but a field of green that did not exist yet. Corn, shoulder high, in Wyoming wind beans, finding purchase, squash, spreading thick children running. Between rows, Aiyana, calling them home in a voice that remembered 2 languages and needed only 1 word. "Home," she whispered. Silas's hand found hers in the dark. He squeezed once the soldier's way of saying, "I am here." She squeezed back the Apache way of saying, "Me too." Between them, sleep rose soft and honest. And beyond the half-built wall, the night listened and decided to let them keep what they had taken back. Because there are some defiances the West accepts as proper. A fence line sets straight a roof that does not leak a woman and a man who choose each other against the loud machinery of men who never learned the names of rivers. Some stories end at sunset. Theirs did not. Theirs went on into morning, where the real work lives. The work of roof nails and handshakes, and the slow braiding of 2 histories into a rope strong enough to cross a chasm. Defiance, it turns out, is not yelling at a tyrant. It is building a porch in the shadow of his favorite courthouse and teaching your children to dance on it. The wind shifted. The roof held. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a hawk woke and shook the frost from its feathers. It looked down and saw 2 people asleep beneath a brand-new roof, and because it is the nature of hawks, to bless what is brave, it launched into the pail and went hunting for breakfast. The day would need feeding. There would be mouths. There would be work. There would be love. The fort was a small square on the horizon. Now the theater struck the audience gone home to tell their versions. The truth, meanwhile, stayed behind in a cabin with a door that stuck a little and a threshold nailed with 3 stubborn pieces of iron. It had a fire. It had 2 cups. It had a list of names in a tin box. It had a roof. And tomorrow it would have more. Spring came late to Bitter Creek that year, as if winter itself had been reluctant to lift its hand from a land that had seen so much blood and choosing. Snow clung in the gulches like stubborn memory. The creek ran high and brown, with melt knocking stones together as if counting them. Meadowlarks returned tentative at first, then bolder, fluting little flags of song along the fence posts. Where Silas's cabin once stood, a new structure was rising larger, truer to the wind, framed to the angle of light. It was not only a house. It was a decision hammered into timber. Aiyana's surviving band had come not just Marcus and Samuel, but 15 others, widows, cousins, boys, whose shoulders had squared too fast, and they worked with the steady economy of people who knew how to make shelter from trouble. Some townspeople, too, those who'd read the Washington reports or heard Wallace in the church hall and felt shame gnaw their ribs, for months of silent compliance, showed up with hammers that made their palms blister and cheeks burn red in the high air. Higher Aiyana directed from the top sill, balanced like a hawk on a cottonwood limb. Window needs to catch morning sun. Her braid swung like a dark plumb line as she sighted along the beam. Chalk marked the place. The saw whispered through, then sang. Chips flew and smelled like rain remembered. Silas steadied the frame while Marcus hammered. They'd learned to work together in the deep winter when breath froze and beards and jokes had to be short to keep from icing. Marcus and Samuel taught him a way of setting posts that resisted heave, a way of laying stones that let the house exhale, a way of listening for the creak under snow that told you where the spring would rise in July. "She's bossy," Marcus said in his improved English, aiming the nail as if it were a point he wished to make. "She's right," Silas replied. Marcus laughed, the sound bright as a strike on steel. The house tailored itself as it grew. 2 rooms instead of 1. A covered porch facing east as Aiyana requested, so the first light finds our faces. Apache symbols carved into doorframes by Samuel's careful knife whirlwind protection, the path that doubles back to outwit bad spirits. A thistle worked into each shutter by Silas's hand, a memory in wood of his grandmother's handkerchiefs. No one asked whose culture counted more. The answer nailed itself in place every morning and held. Marshal Briggs rode up, careful hat in hand, the way a man approaches a ceremony he has not rehearsed. Relations were still tender, but he'd been trying showing up when men muttered, standing quiet as a stone. When boys tried to test him with slurs, seizing whiskey before it seized tempers. "Mail," he said, dismounting. He held out an official envelope with the look of a man delivering a snake in a jar. From Washington. They'd waited months for it, the bureaucratic ripple moving east to west and back with the slow grace of a glacier. Silas opened it, eyes moving fast, then slower. He read it twice and handed it to Aiyana. Congressional hearing completed, she read flat, because paper could not be trusted yet. Hammond's associates arrested. Reparations approved for survivors of Ghost Creek massacre. Formal apology from War Department. The wind paused and listened. "Words," Aiyana said finally. "Just words." "Words that matter," Briggs answered, not defensive, simply offering. "Words that make the next massacre harder." She studied him, this white lawman trying to tilt his world toward decent, then gestured to the rising frame. "This changes things. People choosing to build together. Your town letting me stand on a beam and not aiming rifles at it. Silas teaching your children that Apache are people, not enemies. That changes things." Briggs nodded slowly. "The school board wanted me to ask, would you come speak to the children, tell them about your ways? Dances, foods, the meaning of those little marks you're carving." "You want your children to learn?" she asked, surprise raw as light. "Some do," he said. "It's a start. All things are." After he left, she sat on the half-built porch legs, dangling, looking over pasture and creek, the land laid out like a book. Even a stranger could learn to read with time. Silas joined her, as he did most evenings now, without a need to announce himself. Their quiet had changed in the months since the fort, no longer careful, no longer the hush of hunted things. This silence breathed with them. "Strange world," she said. "6 months ago they hunted me. Now they invite me to teach their children." "You don't have to," he said. "I know." She searched for a word heavy enough. "My grandmother said hate is a seed that grows in darkness. Maybe truth is sunlight." She smiled sideways. She also said men are like goats, loud when you move their rocks. "Your grandmother was wise," Silas said, "and observant." "She would have liked you," Aiyana answered. She said the best warriors are those who choose peace when they could choose war. They watched the sun lower its shoulders into the blue. The mountains put on their evening colors, purple along the ribs, an ember line at the teeth. Somewhere, a cow bawled like a rusty hinge. Somewhere, a hammer finished its last sentence. Footsteps in the grass. Samuel approached, wiping pitch on his trousers, but he wasn't alone. An elderly Apache woman walked beside him, upright, despite the miles in her hips. Her hair was white as creek foam. Her earrings flashed the exact color of afternoon. Aiyana gasped, flew from the porch. "Grandmother," the word broke like ice at thaw. The reunion made a small town of two people tears, and Apache words and hands on faces as if reading Braille, written by wind and years. Silas stood back and let it happen. He had learned not to crowd ancient things. The elder woman's eyes found him anyway, quick as a hawk. So she said in clear English, better than some deacons, "You are the white man who chose my granddaughter over his own people. I chose what was right," he said, "because it fit in the mouth and in the bones." She stepped close and laid weathered hands along his jaw the way one tests a horse's teeth. "You carry death," she said, "old death, but also new life. The spirits argue about you." Grandmother Aiyana murmured, heat in her cheeks. "Hush," the old woman said, still reading him. "You were a killer, now a protector. You were empty." Now she looked between them, saw the frame door, the unroofed sky. "Now you are family." She spoke rapid Apache. Aiyana protested, then nodded, blushing toward her caller. "She asks if we have been proper," she translated reluctantly. "If we have honored ways." What ways? Silas asked, because he would not pretend knowledge he didn't have. The grandmother laughed like wind through canyon. "Child, every people has ways, ceremonies, promises, bindings." Her gaze sharpened. "You live as married, but haven't spoken it to the spirits or your God." It was true. Survival had been the only liturgy for months. Roof beams rationed, flower bullets counted like prayers. Promise had been lived, not spoken. "Tomorrow," the grandmother declared. "New moon. Good for beginnings." "Grandmother, we can't," just Aiyana began. "You can," the old woman said. "You will, both ways, Apache and white. Make it real to every watcher, seen and unseen." By the next dusk, a congregation invented itself. Aiyana's band stood with hair braided and faces washed, wearing moccasins, newly stitched the men's shirts, beaded at the yoke. Townspeople came not in Sunday best, but in their working clothes, a sign truer than polish. Mrs. Calhoun brought a platter of little oatcakes. The Bennetts arrived with stew. Briggs stood at the edge, hat off, uncharacteristically humble. Commander Wallace materialized like law, summoned by honest need, his horse breathing fog into the purple air. Aiyana wore her grandmother's wedding dress, white dawskin, that draped like river water, worked over a century by patient hands into patterns you could hear if you listened. Silas wore his best shirt sleeve stiff at the cuff, and his father's watch, the only inheritance that hadn't burned or been traded for something you could eat. They began with the old tongue. The grandmother spoke, Marcus translating in pieces to the circle who needed English the way a new shoot needs a stick. The couple touched earth first, palms on soil, the smell of it climbing into their chests. They shared breath foreheads together, inhaling the same flame of air. The grandmother bound their wrists with braided sweetgrass that smelled like altar and grasshoppers and new roofs. "You promise to walk beside?" she asked Silas in English eyes, unsubtle, not ahead or behind. "I promise." "You promise to see her as she is, not as you wish her to be?" "I promise." To Aiyana, "You promise to teach him our ways without losing yourself." "I promise." "You promise to honor his ancestors while remembering your own." "I promise." Her voice ran the ridge between tears and laughter. The grandmother lifted a bowl of water from the creek and touched it to their foreheads, to their mouths, to the braided cord. For clarity, for truth, for endurance. Wallace stepped forward, clearing his throat hat under arm, discomfort covered by duty. He did not give a sermon. He simply asked the old words, "Do you, Silas McKenna, take Aiyana to be your wife? To have and hold in sickness and health and plenty, and want in peace and war until death do you part?" Silas looked at Aiyana and saw not a prettied moment, but the entire trail, the snow where he'd carried her, the creek where they'd split water, and fear the ridge where she'd stood between him and a bullet with nothing but courage for armor. "I do." "And you, Aiyana, take Silas to be your husband?" "I do," she said. English steady, then added in Apache for the grandmothers. "In this life, and whatever comes after." Wallace lifted his hand, the small distance required to make things official between men who need paper. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you." "Wait," the grandmother said, cutting government with a knife made of humor. She turned to the couple. "Now you are one path with two walkers, one story with two voices, one home with two hearts. The spirits witness. The earth remembers. Go forward together. She nodded toward Wallace. Now say your part. He did. Everyone laughed. Relieved nodded together by it. Food found hands. Apache fry bread. Venison in red chile and venison in cream and mustard. 2 ways, 1 animal honored both times. Oatcakes and honey. Coffee that could hold a nail upright. Whiskey that softened the edges of grief without erasing any of its names. Strange wedding, Briggs said to Wallace as stars climbed the fence. Strange times, Wallace said, gaze on the braid around their wrists. Maybe we've needed strange for a long while. When the last congratulations had been squeezed, and the last dish had been reclaimed, and the last fiddle line had faded, Silas and Aiyana sat on the new porch, steps her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist like a fat. No regrets, she asked. None, he said. One, she said softly. He tensed. What I wish my sister could see this, she answered. She saved me so I could live. I think she'd be happy to know I chose to live fully, not merely survive. She knows, Silas said. He believed that the way some people believe in tides. Somehow she knows. They listened to the creek and the wind, each say their piece. Then Aiyana said, the papers are delivered. Hammond's finished. The immediate danger is past. What do we do now? Now we build, he said. Not just this house a life. Help the other survivors. Walk stubbornly into every room that says no and make it learn to say yes. Maybe we work for better laws. Maybe we just prove by getting up and milking and mending and teaching that Apache and White can live beside one another without one swallowing the other. That's a lot of, maybe she smiled. That's a lot of tomorrow. She studied his face lit by the kind of moon that makes promises look probable. Are you ready for the difficulty? The stares. The judgment from both sides. The constant explaining, are you? I've been explaining my existence. My whole life, she said. At least now I'll have someone listening who understands. Then we're ready. Hoofbeats came and both of them went still for a breath, the body remembering how to read danger long after the mind thinks it is done. But it was only Marcus and Samuel leading a string of ponies with ribbons braided into mane. Wedding gift, Marcus announced, from the band. For the ranch you're building, Samuel added, practical. Can't just farm. Need horses, cattle, proper work. And Marcus said, his grin, the sun rising over trouble we're staying. Building places nearby. Someone must make sure you treat our cousin right. You mean Aiyana, said laughter, like a bell you need somewhere to sleep while you court Mary Bennett? Marcus reddened beautifully and did not deny it. Silas felt the word belonging loosen in his chest and expand like good bread. That night, in the temporary lean-to, while the plaster cured and the roof remembered how to be roof in rain, Aiyana taught Silas an old lullaby that cadence women used when the men were gone and the night was too large. Silas taught her a Scots ballad his grandmother hummed when the doe rose. The melodies tried to resist each other, then gave in and found a third road between. They sang until they both laughed, and then they slept under a blanket that felt heavier than its weight. Late spring snow fell like apology, gentle and brief, the sort that melts by breakfast and leaves everything clean-edged. Inside warmth held. Love held. The choice they'd made held. By summer the house wore its bones, under skin daubs smoothed and whitewashed shutters, painted a blue nobody could quite name, because it was made from leftover tins mixed until Aiyana liked it. A long table lived under the porch roof. For whoever arrived, tired, hungry, needing to sit and be nobody's enemy for an hour. A reporter from back east arrived with a notebook and a hat that looked annoyed with the wind. He introduced himself to Silas at the fence and to Aiyana on the porch, tipped his hat, as if to a phenomenon rather than a person, and asked if he might sketch a few details for readers hungry for a symbol. How did you overcome your differences, he asked, pencil poised for a neat answer. Aiyana and Silas exchanged a glance that said years. We didn't, Aiyana said. We honored them. But surely the cultural divide, the reporter pressed, is real, Silas interrupted, and will remain real. Bridges don't erase the river. They make the crossing possible. The reporter scribbled dissatisfied, wanting the kind of tidiness that sells well in parlors, where dust is theoretical. He asked to photograph them. Aiyana agreed only if Marcus and Mary Bennett stood beside them, and if Mrs. Calhoun, and if Samuel, and if Briggs, and if the school children who'd learned to beat a bit came too. The plate captured a crowd no headline could make simple. Somewhere in the corner of that picture a thistle and a whirlwind shared a shutter. The schoolhouse smelled like chalk and terror the first time Aiyana spoke. Briggs had warned her, some parents will keep their young ones home. He had been right. But the children who came half rowdy, half scared of being rowdy, in front of a woman whose eyes could pin trout to a board, leaned forward, because newness is sugar to kids. Aiyana brought beads and sinew, and a bowl of cornmeal and a story. She taught them to read the small language of pattern, how blue near white is water, how red in triangles is danger, how the empty space is as important as the fill. She did not tell them grief was geometry, but they felt it, the way a zigzag contains thunder, the way a circle forgives. A boy raised a hand. "My pa says your people steal horses." "Sometimes," she said, "sometimes your people stole us." The room stiffened. She held the boy's eyes kindly. "We are not our worst days, but we must not lie about them. Today you can steal a color from me, and I will not call the sheriff." The room laughed and the boy relaxed as laughter made a map for him across something difficult. After the teacher, a woman with ink on her fingers clasped Aiyana's hands and said thank you, as if she were allowed to use that many vowels only on holidays. Out in the yard, 3 girls showed Aiyana a bead pattern they'd made for their hair. It was crooked and beautiful and exactly right. By autumn, calves bawled in the lower pasture. A string of young horses learned that fear could be made into movement in the right hands. Silas and Marcus argued amiably about fences and water rights and how to keep cattle from teaching themselves arithmetic. Samuel spent evenings drafting land claims in a hand so neat, even judges respected it. Aiyana taught beadwork to town children, then to their mothers, then to the preacher's wife, who confessed she'd always wanted to know how to make meaning with thread. When a letter came with a seal from Washington and an amount that seemed indecent next to the smallness of the dead, Aiyana accepted the reparation and walked it straight to Wallace's office, where a fund had been made for winter coal and seeds. "Give most to the old ones and the children," she told him. "Give some to the stubborn men, but make them carry it under their tongues until it tastes like humility." Wallace smiled where smiles rarely went. There were ugly days. A man spit at Silas in front of the feed store, not because of law or land, but because his own house had gone small, and he wanted someone else's to shrink too. Silas didn't swing. Briggs came and stood behind the man and said nothing. It worked like a sermon should. The man swallowed his spit. A woman from town, the color of frost and vinegar, refused to let Aiyana serve her at the church supper, though the stew had been made by Aiyana's own hands with venison Silas had dressed. Mrs. Calhoun swapped the bowls without asking permission, and told a story in a voice that brooked no interruption about the time she'd helped birth a child whose head came out with hair like a rain cloud and eyes like here she looked straight at. Aiyana, brand new mornings. The vinegar dissolved. People ate. In the middle of all this came the smallest, largest news one evening. Aiyana stood by the window and pressed Silas's palm low on her belly. Under his hand, something said hello. He looked up, and the porch lights they'd strung months earlier seemed to grow stars of their own. "Our children will be confused," she said that night, lying with her head on his arm. "Not Apache, not white. Our children will be bridges," he answered. "Bridges belong to both shores and to themselves." "Children," she repeated, astonished at how right the word felt in her mouth. "You want children with me? I want everything with you," he said. Every difficult, beautiful, complicated thing. She kissed him slow as rain finding a root. News traveled in the quiet way it should. The grandmother set her loom closer to the hearth and began a pattern that turned out to be a cradleboard cover. Samuel brought juniper wood, soft as butter, for carving a tiny horse. Marcus found himself carving a second tiny horse he swore was for whoever then blushed when Mary Bennett laughed. One morning Aiyana woke to the sound of her grandmother humming and realized the tune had no words because the future had not taught them yet. She added a line. The old woman nodded. The spirits argued, she said later, weaving. But they decided what Aiyana asked, cleaning beans at the table, the rhythm of it the same as prayer, that new things can